All right. Today I am excited to be joined by Dr. Andrew Root, the Carrie Olson Balson Chair of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary. Dr. Root has written many books, including his most recent series of 3 books, Ministry in a Secular Age, which focuses in on faith formation, pastor, and congregation in a secular age. And today we're going to be honing in on the topic of faith formation in a secular age. So Dr. Root, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for making this happen.
Absolutely. So I'm almost done. I was telling you earlier with all of your books, and from the extensive footnotes in each of them, it becomes clear that these weren't you just like writing some of your thoughts down or a quick take on culture, but these are truly a deep dive of culture and theology and really making accessible and relatable some big themes and ideas. And so I'm curious, like, what was the genesis of this book series for you? Was there a moment or a series of events that inspired you to undertake these books? And
Yeah.
was there a reason you started with faith formation?
Yeah, so those are all really great questions. And you're right, there's too many footnotes in them. You're looking at a footnote-aholic. So I don't know what's happened, but I am addicted to my to footnotes, and my poor editor just thinks it's crazy. But that's nice of you to say. There is trying to be a larger, deeper conversation going on here. And so I'd say there's two things that inspired them. One, from really back in my days of doing youth ministry and doing pastoral ministry, the big question, it feels like, that we have to wrestle with, that I've been trying to explore throughout my work, is how do we help people really encounter the living presence of God? What does that look like? How do we help them make sense of it? What shape does it take? And how do our ministries not get kind of co-opted by certain kind of marketing forms, certain kind of ways of kind of taking on consumer flavors? How do we really keep our attention on a God who really is God, and not be kind of overtaken by just institution building? Not that that's all bad, or just trying to convince people to participate. How do we get to the depth of really encountering the living God? So that's always been a driving question, and I think in the second half of each of the books that gets picked up. But the unique flavor, and I guess what kind of birthed this forward, is that this Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor, who's quite an old man now, he's in his 90s, and so he's done his greatest work towards the end of his life. But in 2007, he wrote an epic book that really took almost a decade for the rest of the academic world to really be able to get their arms around it. And for instance, for it to kind of move beyond even just philosophy. And I tell my own students that it really probably is the first philosophy book written in the 21st century, 2007, that will probably be read in the 22nd century. It will be read 100 years later. So it's a really epic, important book, but it is a big, thick book. Like, if it falls off your shelf and lands on your head, it will concuss you and you will be in the hospital. So it's a 700-page book. Almost closer to 800, actually. It's like 790 pages, and then you have the index and the footnotes in it, and it's like almost 1,000 pages. And he only wants to answer one question. Charles Taylor's this Canadian Quebecois McGill professor, and he wants to answer one question. And the question is, why, if we just have big round numbers, and if we just say, look at 1500 in the Western world, if you go back to 1500, just a short, relatively speaking, short 500 years ago, why was it nearly impossible to be a part of the West and not believe in God? It was really difficult. It was almost impossible to live in our societies 100 years ago and not believe in God. And yet in a short 500 years, that is completely flipped. And now it's much easier for people, particularly on our coasts and in urban settings, and particularly on the continent of Europe, maybe even more so than in America. But it's easier to not believe in God than to believe in God. And so he really wants to articulate how that happened. What are the dynamics that create such a society? And I find it really captivating, and him to be really insightful on a lot of those things. So part of the task of these books has been to try to, I guess, synthesize that in some ways, or to provide some creative angles to it. And he's trying to think of it at a more kind of sociological, philosophical, political kind of political, philosophical, political science kind of level. And I'm trying to put it in the context of like the pastor, the church and the congregation, thinking about how we pass on faith to other people, to younger people. What difference does that make? And I have a particular sense that those of us who make distinctive Christian claims and those of us who are leading in ministry, whether as lay leaders or as pastors or as children's ministers, that we have to deal with some of these phenomena um, in a really acute way that he's describing. So part of it is to kind of lay that out and synthesize that, and then try to offer my own kind of unique theological take on it. So that's kind of what inspired it. So it's a fairly nerdy inspiration, like reading this book and thinking there's a lot going on here, and this is something pastors and ministers and people in churches need to hear about.
That's awesome. And when you were thinking about this, you named pastor, congregation, faith
Oh.
formation, and you mentioned that you worked in youth ministry and now teach youth ministry. Was that a driving factor for starting with faith formation?
Yeah, it was. So, I mean, I've kind of stayed connected and teach and train a lot of youth workers, trying to help them see the theological depth or just the importance of ministry itself. And that there's been so many, I think, for Protestants particularly, a real trap in youth ministry that reflects something to the whole church, which is this kind of sense if we can just have the cool factor, if we can just find the marketing angle, then we can solve our problems. So one of the main reasons I focused on faith formation originally was because Taylor gave me some language to understand why I had a little bit of an uncomfortable feeling with a lot of some of the best faith formation literature that was out there that was getting right into churches in the way that churches were defining faith. So a lot of the ways we define faith, in the way we would talk about how we need to pass on faith to another generation, or we need to look at how young people are walking away from the faith, or we need new kind of programs or new forms of ministry that will help faith. And we usually like to add a lot of adjectives to faith. We want it to be consequential or deep or robust or whatever. And a lot of that comes from sociologists, which I actually love sociologists. Like sociologists, some sociologists are my best friends. I love sociologists, but the definition that was getting into the church, it felt like to me, was almost coming uncritically from sociologists. So a sociologist has to define faith in a certain way, and this isn't to be critical of them. They have to define it in a certain way, like in a sociology of religion. They have to define it a certain way so that they can measure it. That's what the field does. So usually you get definitions of faith like that point to consent and belief, like do you believe the Bible is the word of God? A little bit, or a ton, B a little less, and so forth. It goes down. That usually is one way of measuring faith. Like you ask people, do you believe this? Wow, look at this generation believes less about the Bible, or they don't believe there's an afterlife or whatever. The other thing you do is that's much more existential for a lot of pastors is in churches, is you ask them how often they participate. Like do they show up? And it just felt like to me when we were talking about faith formation that the definition of faith that we used, that we wanted to talk about what we were forming people into, was kind of captured by that sociological imagination. And a lot of ministry people and church people weren't, I don't know, I don't mean this to be harsh, but there wasn't as critical of engagement. There wasn't as theological or a biblical kind of conversation of what is faith, and when we're trying to form faith in young people, but really in all people, what are we really talking about? Is it really kind of consent to belief, and is it really just participation, or is there something else at stake here? And the whole Charles Taylor piece was to say, there's a certain reason why we almost don't think about it. Like it becomes almost unthought that what faith is participation and kind of consent to believe something. And by that I mean like propositionally, like I believe these 8 things are true. And so that was really what I guess led me to start with faith formation, because it has no real coherent logic on why start with faith formation and then go to the pastor and then go to the congregation, other than it's just where the energy was, I guess. I don't know. So that's probably
Yeah.
why. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting as you name that, because even in our churches, we define membership and different types of membership by the frequency of attendance. And after so many years, you can call somebody and say, "Oh, you're no longer an active member." And so that frequency of participation of how we measure, and even what I hear you saying a little, I was telling somebody we're having this conversation and said, yeah, he wrote a book called Faith Formation in the Secular Age. And I could see they kind of like stepped back a little bit. And I was like, what's your response to that? And he's like, oh, secular age, like the church in the secular age. I was like, oh, you're probably thinking that like this is going to be a book about how the church needs to double down on its actions because we're losing the war on the secular age and need to like close more malls on Sundays. And so
Right.
I think that like people have that mindset of faith and participation of
Yeah.
attendance and engagement in that way. And so kind of leading to my next question, you classify secular age in 3 ways, or in 3 different stages. Could you talk about those stages a little
Yeah.
bit, and especially in the North American church, and how they've responded to these 3?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you're saying when you're talking to this person and they're like secular age. There's just a lot of confusion. Like we all kind of know what we mean when we say, "Oh, the West is becoming more secular," or the problem with Charlotte is secularism is blowing through it, or the problem even with our classic religious universities is they're becoming more secular. We kind of know what we mean when we say that, but we're not really sure. And if you get enough people in the room to kind of talk about what they mean, you start to realize they mean different things, or there's a different emphasis for each kind of person in that. So that's one of the great contributions that Taylor gives us that led me to think, oh my gosh, this, when we think about faith formation, we could really use this kind of lens to help us think about it. Because Taylor's point is, and this is a really, I mean, it's interesting because some people have been critical of him and saying, because the book is called A Secular Age, and saying, well, we're not really in a secular age because it seems like there's more pluralistic religious expressions than ever. Like if you go into New York City, you'll find not no religion, you'll find religions everywhere. In every urban area is becoming more and more pluralistically religion. So we're not becoming more secular. And he wants to say, yeah, you're right, but also let's talk about this. So he does give us a certain kind of historical progression here. And I don't want to get you can stop me, John, when this becomes like the air becomes too thin and it's like no one cares about this. So because I can get self-indulgent, you'll get in my footnotes. Keep me out of my footnotes. All right. But he wants to say we do first need to remember when we're talking about the big question is why in 1500 impossible not to believe in God? Why in 2000 is it really quite easy to not believe in God? And that to remember that 500 years ago, there was a time where there was no secular, that the way Western Europe and the Western world worked is that if you couldn't come up to someone in the 13th century and be like, hey, what church do you go to? Like that wouldn't make any sense to them. Or like, hey, do you like your church? What do you think? Like there would be big questions like, we are afraid that our priest has been overtaken by the devil, or that the bishop is, the bishop is doing witchcraft. I mean, there could be situations like that, but no one was like, I don't know if I need this in my life. Like you were to live in those societies was to believe, and the whole liturgy of those societies was everywhere. So when I do presentations on this, and if I would have been able to come to your church, I mean, I would have shown a slide from The Handmaid's Tale and been like, the only example I have of what this is like after a modern world is The Handmaid's Tale, that dystopian Hulu series, where it's freaky because it's a secular zero world, and the liturgy just spills everywhere. The way you dress and the way you talk when you meet someone at the supermarket, and you're like under his eye and may the Lord open. And so it's really hard not to believe, and it's particularly hard And this is one of the reasons I wrote the book, is to be really anxious about people leaving the church and deciding not to leave. Like in a secular zero world, you couldn't leave if you wanted to leave, like that wasn't really possible. So first of all, remembering that there was a time that there wasn't a secular. So I've been calling that now, and I didn't call it this in the yellow book. And I probably should have, but that there was like a secular zero world. There was where the secular was set at zero. But we enter into a secular world when we have a new divide or a new way of we're trying to find unity between what's public and what's private. And so secular, this is what Taylor calls secular one. And you actually really alluded to it, like the grieving of the mall or the movie theater, as Stanley Howard Watts wrote, 20 years ago. Like when the movie theater in the South is open on Sunday, secular forces have come in. And what of course has happened there is that the public institutions don't seem to support the private belief of people anymore. So before, stores were closed because people were privately going to be spending time in worship services, and the public institutions were respecting people's private space to do that, or the institutions of private religion like Sunday worship and like the congregation. So you didn't have youth sports and things like that. But we kind of don't respect that boundary as much anymore. But we do still assume that faith and belief is a kind of private reality. It's something that you kind of decide, that you consent to believing. But then that opens the door for us to enter into what we might call secular two, which is the kind of classic way we've often thought of secular. And if we did have that straw poll of what do you think the secular is and have people define it, most people would define it as a secular two reality, which what it means to live in a secular age is that fewer and fewer people go to church. In other words, people's belief is supposed to be an internal thing. Now the malls are open. Now that becomes a competitive space. Now there's youth sports, and people are choosing to go to that kind of stuff instead of going to church, instead of working on their kind of private religion, or working on really what they believe and participating in a significant way. And this becomes what I said is, secular too. And my sense is, looking at most of the anxiety that is in Protestantism, even in very well-placed churches, that most of the anxiety is around secular too, that we are competing up against religious competitors like youth sports, like fantasy football, like coffee shops. And you think, like, how can we get more people to come, or how do we keep people from disappearing? And that our definitions of faith usually fit right within that. Because secular two is really easy to measure instrumentally, So go ahead. Sorry.
Is that where you feel like the adjectives start to come in, where there's that
Absolutely.
feels like there's that competition, and so the adjectives come in to compete almost?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you feel like, I think you really helped me here as we thought about that. Like the whole conversation about now the movie theater's open, now youth sports is there, that once you enter into secular two, you really feel like that's a competition. And so if you just produce faith, that's not going to be enough, because what you need to produce is consequential faith. What you need is vibrant faith. What you need is forms of faith that needs some kind of adjectival descriptor, or they're not going to be able to hold up to the siren call of whatever it might be. And so yeah, and it is to say, like, that is an issue. Like, it's not to, I'm not trying to say, well, that's stupid and that doesn't affect our churches. And anyone who runs a budget in a religious organization knows, like, it's a big deal if people decide not to show up. And in American Protestantism particularly is all based on people being willing to show up, and if they don't show up, I say this to denominational leaders, like, any denomination can only exist for one more generation. And what I mean by that is, if the next generation of people don't decide to willfully enact, like they don't decide to show up and put money in the offering plate, or subscribe to the denominational magazine or whatever it might be, it doesn't exist in the next generation. And so all of that anxiety and that feel like the a-religious space and the religious space are more in competition than ever leads us to feel like, well, we have to compete and we need the adjective faith. And what we should really be measuring is how often people come and are they really committed, really committed. And yeah, and that just becomes kind of what we think the good congregation is, the good pastor is, the good faith formation program is able to capture people's attention and particularly their participation.
And so that's secular 2. What would Taylor say, and how do you understand secular 3?
Yeah. So this is the big deal. Like this is the shift. And so Taylor wants to say, and I would definitely affirm, working with pastors more than Taylor does for sure, is that if you are in any kind of leadership, if you're on, if you're on the session of your church, that you feel the pinch of secular 2, like you're aware that it is an issue and there is a legitimate fear that people could leave. But Taylor wants to say what really makes us what to say we live in a secular age, what that really means is not that fewer and fewer people are going to church. What it really means to be secular or to live in a secular age is that all forms of belief become contested, or all forms of belief become fragilized. So to be in this kind of secular age, he's right. You can go to New York City, you can go into downtown Charlotte, and you can find a lot of pluralistic religions. Like you can find a lot of people living that out. But what that has the ramifications of is it makes us very aware that we could be living a different way, that what we believe, even the person across the street who seems to actually be a better parent than you doesn't believe anything, or is part of a different kind of church or a different kind of religious institution, and they seem to be doing okay. So it is this kind of sense of fragilization. And what Taylor says, it even goes a step further, which I think he's really right on this, is that if you're a believing person in this kind of secular age, you can't help but feel thrust into doubt at times, that you feel like you would just wonder, like, okay, I believe this. No, I believe this. But you also are kind of crossed up. You have this kind of cross pressure where you also think once in a while, like, oh, is this really true, or is this just the family I grew up in? I mean, if I would have grown up somewhere else in the world, with a different kind of family, would I believe this? No. I believe it. And then you think, well, then you get kind of come up short again. You get cross pressured again, and you think, is this true? Or is this just an evolutionary trick? I mean, is all religion is false pattern recognition? Is that all this is? And so his point is, if you're a believing person, you just are always dealing with at times doubt. Your belief becomes fragilized. And part of my point about faith formation is what we do when we think secular 2 is the issue, is that fragilization. We want to protect people from it, either institutionally or in some way, or sometimes, and depending on the tradition, like giving people all the pat answers. We want to somehow protect them, and particularly young people, we want to protect them from any of that fragilization. And so what we do is then ramp up the resources we can give them in secular 2 that keep them coming, and the ways we can build kind of a nice protective bubble around them so they don't feel that cross pressure. But the issue is that there's no way to really live in this world without that happening. That this kind of secular, it's just in the air we breathe. And so, and what I kind of point to that we can talk about is that Paul himself, who's not a secular person, nor is he a modern person. I mean, we're talking about a process of modernity. So I'm not trying to say like Paul is, a secular 3 person. That wouldn't be right. But Paul's view of faith really is quite interesting next to secular 3, because his own transformation and conversion experience is to have his faith fragilized, to find cross pressure in Acts 9, where everything he knows, and he continues to say it all over again, like, I was the classic secular 2 person. Like, I went to the best universities, I was part of the best church, best discipleship program. No one could have gone through a better faith formation program than Saul went through, but on the road to Damascus, there's a huge moment of cross pressure where everything becomes fragilized. And in this situation, it becomes fragilized in light of an encounter with the living Jesus Christ. Saul, it's me, it's Jesus that you persecute. And Saul has to think again, what does it mean to actually have faith? And it is not this kind of very protective, unfragile kind of sense of belief. It's not having all your beliefs locked down. He had that. What it means to believe is to find new life, to find the God of the cross and Jesus Christ bringing life out of death, and bringing life out of your fragilized experience of death. Like when you feel cross pressured, and Taylor means cross pressured like a rapid, but you can also think of kind of Paul here without it being too cheesy, like a sense of like cross pressure. Like for him, there is this sense where the cross is the image of faith, in that what you do is you can never have these big adjectival faiths, because faith is always in the shape of Jesus on the cross. So it's always weak, but it's a profound reality that out of its weakness, death can be overcome. That it is so that the move of faith is the confession of your death experience. It's the confession of your fragilization. So that's Taylor's point, is that secular 3 is that all beliefs become fragilized. But what's really fascinating about him is that it works the other way as well. So if you're a believing person and you live in this kind of age, you can't help but doubt sometimes. And, hopefully I've given you a little bit of an angle of what faith can look like there. But he says, if you're an unbelieving person, like let's say you're a young adult who lives in Brooklyn, and you're into knitting and you're a hipster and you've been educated somewhere in the Research Triangle in North Carolina, like what religion is, man. Like it's just a historical reality used by the powerful people to keep less powerful people down. And come on, what happens when you die? It's like a TV set. When it gets unplugged, it's over. It's just done. Like that's what happens. Taylor's point is, if that's what you believe is you don't believe anything. He thinks that what will happen to you in this kind of secular age is even that belief system of not believing anything will become fragilized. And there will be moments when you find yourself believing. Like you don't believe any of this, you don't believe any of it. And then you get invited to go to a Christmas concert, and you go and you sit at the back of the, of the cathedral or of the music hall, and you hear this Bach music. And maybe you had too many drinks at dinner, but all of a sudden you just feel something reaching for you in the universe. You feel like there's more to this. Like there has to be some purpose bigger than you in life. Or, like a classic one we know from research studies is that people who don't believe anything have their first child and hold that child for the first time and are all of a sudden like, whoa, holy cow. Like I thought this was nothing but randomness in the universe. And now I wonder if there isn't something bigger. So his point is it's a two-way fragilization. And that's what it means to live in secular 3. And my point is that's the environment we do ministry in. And so often we kind of look at the secular 2 issue, see fewer and fewer people are going to church. But maybe the reason there are fewer and fewer people going to church is not because the resources aren't there to capture them. Like they're really just interested in coffee shops. So what if we had a coffee shop in our church? Like what we could solve that problem. No, the real issue is fragilization on both sides. The real issue for formation and discipleship is how do we seek for God up against our coming fragilization, our coming cross pressure? And even how do we think about evangelism and sharing the depth of the gospel with people who don't believe but are going to become fragilized in that? And how do we invite them into journeying and searching for a living God in this world?
Amen. Wow. Well, and I think just as I hear you talk about the fragilization from both ends, a word that comes to my mind is vulnerability.
Mm.
And that's probably not one of the adjectives that people want to slap on
Yeah.
or broken on a curriculum, but it seems like the posture of vulnerability or witnessing vulnerability, practicing vulnerability, both for the members in the church who have those cross pressures of doubt, and for people in the community that will hit that fragilization in their life at some point. So yeah, how do you see vulnerability as part of what the church is called to, particularly as faith formation?
Yeah, I think that vulnerability is a really nice way to say it, and it's something that's finding its way into our larger kind of understandings of ourselves, of how, the bravery to be vulnerable. And I think there really is a move in that. To give it like kind of classic Christian language, there is something that's central, in faith formation in the Christian life, of confession, of continuing to confess, and that does take that is enacted vulnerability to confess. And so for me, like in the yellow book particularly, well, there's two things to say that connect the yellow book and the blue book together, is that this vulnerability often needs another human being who will share that vulnerability with you. So Paul becomes quite vulnerable, and he becomes quite vulnerable because he's knocked to the ground and can no longer see, and is taken to Judas' house on a street called Straight, and his whole life has been fragilized. And someone comes and shares in that vulnerability with him, and Ananias becomes this great hero of faith, who I actually don't think it's enough pub for like the heroic move of faith. But what does he do? He goes to Paul, and he doesn't give him a program, or he doesn't like even get him through a track. He doesn't do anything that would allude to more secular two realities. He just shares in this experience with them. He just is with and for him in the midst of the fragilization. And that dual vulnerability of Paul's vulnerability, of finding himself in the midst of an utter death experience where everything he knows has been lost, and Ananias just being with and for him in sharing that, becomes transformational. I mean, transformation transforms Saul into Paul. I mean, a hugely transformational reality. But the dynamic that I try to push forward in the blue book and try to tell pastors, and I think it relates to lay leaders as well, is that it's not just a pure vulnerability for vulnerability, and now we're like in a vulnerability club, and isn't that great? Like, that's good, and it is the first step. But what happens inside of that shared vulnerability of persons who really see each other is there becomes a dynamic of ministering to and for one another. So Ananias goes and becomes Paul's minister, and then Paul, I think, goes into the world and starts his congregations as communities of ministry. That there has to be vulnerability, there has to be confession of the cross, because faith is always the gift of Jesus Christ coming in the midst of impossibility, inside of loss, bringing forth newness out of what has been broken and what has been lost. But we go into the world and participate in that way by being ministers to one another and to our neighbors. So it is about us being vulnerable, but it is also about us receiving the humanity of the other person, and being with and for them. And so there's just this beautiful dynamic, even in Jesus' own life, where Jesus obviously gives ministry. He casts demons out, and he makes sure 5,000 people are fed, and he raises children from the dead. I mean, he gives ministry, but he also receives ministry. And so when the woman comes and spends a lot of money that could, in a secular two-way, could have been used to buy a gymnasium for a church, or could have been cashed in to have a new staff person or get better projectors. I mean, that's essentially what the disciples say. Like, we could have used this money better. I mean, we could have used it to build our movement, or we could have used the money even to just give it to an NGO that could have done some good things with it. We could have done stuff with this money. And Jesus says, no, 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 she's preparing me for my death. Like, he has to receive ministry too, which is the same kind of dynamic when he goes to the woman on the well, when he asks for the water, that he needs to be ministered to. And it's in this kind of mutual dynamic where Jesus is always the one who is salvation, but he also has this way of, in his own vulnerability, needing water, having his feet anointed. There becomes a real deep relationship of shared life, and then he's able to speak into people's lives and is able to bring real life out of death. And so yeah.
So you're talking about secular 3,
Yeah.
where people aren't even willing to, or not willing, experiencing an encounter with God. It's easy to not believe.
Yeah.
And we talk about these cross pressures, and being with and for people kind of in these cross pressures as ministers, and that is faith formation. That is a part of this, being with and for each other. And just thinking about how the church has looked for a while in secular two, pumping resources into programming to try to get these adjectives for folks to come back. And I mean, and that's the world that I grew up in, right? That's how
Yeah,
I was.
me too. Me too.
I
Yep.
was formed,
Yep.
and loved it.
Mhm.
Loved summer camp and vacation Bible school and Sunday school, and so it had a huge benefit in my life. But when I'm thinking about faith formation and people not even expecting to experience God in their lives, but
Yeah.
then are being tried to give these answers, right, to protect them from the cross pressures. I mean, even like that itself seems like a cross pressure, like the protecting of, so you don't enter into secular three to have these doubts, but the pool of the world in the secular three, like it's almost as if the church is creating its own cross pressure within itself.
Yeah.
And as you were talking earlier about that, those protections, uh, there have been a ton of authors who come out of a much more conservative world and have kind of like broken into, I mean, thinking of Nadia Bolz-Weber and others like her, that it seems like that was kind of their experience, that the church created its own
Right.
cross pressure of sorts. Do you experience that or see that?
Yeah. Yeah. So another concept that that Taylor works, and, this is like classic. This is why I like him, but this is why I also like footnotes, John. Because I like thinkers who make up words, and I like to make up stuff. And you do realize it's not very helpful to readers, and there's some people who don't read it because it's like, why is there all these made up words? But Taylor has this made up concept that I find really captivating. But maybe it's just because I think making up stuff is rock and roll. But he has this concept called the imminent frame. And what he means is that one of the reasons it's so easy to not believe in God now compared to 1500 is that the kind of default frame that we see the world through, and this just comes to us through the way we're educated, the way we consume media, just it's in the air, the cultural air we breathe. And it really doesn't matter if you go to church or not, it's just there. You can't really avoid it. Is that our default frame is one of more immanence than transcendence. It is one more of the natural and material than the supernatural. Where if you were to go back to the 13th century in Paris, people's default frame would have been supernatural. So a weird thing happens, and my gosh, that must be the devil. That must be demons at play. Or your daughter starts acting weird. It could be witchcraft. You know what I mean? She must be dabbling in witchcraft. There's all those kind of stereotypical kind of horror movie kind of things. But our frame is more of an imminent one. And what my fear is that leads to some of this discontent that you're talking about is when we get too when we misdiagnose that our issue is secular too, fewer and fewer people are going to participate. Then that means the answer to get them to participate is to produce more resources, to be able to battle in the marketplace of participation for them to come to our church. And what that almost always is more imminently bound realities. Let's have coffee shops. Let's do this. Let's market like this. And not all that is bad. Like you were saying, I mean, you were raised with that, and there are really good things that happen. Same with me, absolutely. But if we're not careful, then what that does is it perpetuates this closed spin of imminence, that all the reasons to come to this church are imminent bound, and we're really focused more on imminence. And then all Jesus can become is an idea that is the product of the institution you're trying to keep going. And so it just becomes an idea. And the German theologian and martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his classic Christian book that I'm sure some of your people have read or at least know about, The Cost of Discipleship, is really clear that cheap grace is when grace becomes an idea. Cheap grace is when even the Christian confession just becomes an idea. He doesn't think it's an idea. He thinks it is an encounter with a person, with the very personhood of Jesus Christ, who is alive and living in the world and calling us. In that book, Bonhoeffer is screaming at us to follow this living Jesus Christ that he thinks is the only hope for Germany in the midst of war gathering and the evils of World War II about to happen. And so that becomes part of the issue, is that you feel like, oh, these people are walking away. We need to give them more. We need to have more resources. We need to use more strategies to keep them here. That you just perpetuate the imminent frame. Jesus turns into an idea. And when that becomes fragilized, there's nothing. When that becomes, when you become discontent with that and fragilization comes in, you got nothing else. You have nothing else than becoming like an ex-evangelical and being frustrated with your church and walking away from the faith. And yet the whole reason to have all those resources and try to find all those adjective faiths is to keep people from walking away. So part of my issue is that we're actually potentially making the problem worse if we don't get right on the diagnosis of what really is the issue. And the issue is really that we are bound in this imminent frame, and we need to help people find a way to imagine again, to see again, to be led into being able to have the vision to see a living God moving in their lives. And
So let's get,
yeah,
oh,
go.
I'm so sorry. I was gonna say,
No,
let's get
go.
transcendent. Let's get transcendent a little bit.
Let's get transcendent. Yes.
So thinking about faith being with and for one another as ministers in those cross pressures. So I'm reading your green book now, and I got to the part where you know, we're in this sped up world, and we can experience something, but our response can be, that just happened.
Yeah.
And we don't dive into the experience, right?
Right.
So as I hear you talking, one of my fears is we can hit those cross pressure moments, but if we aren't formed in how to see and speak and witness into those moments, we just say, well, that just happened. And so, you know, whether it's
And
in
move
your,
on, like you're saying, and just move on. Yeah.
yeah. So whether it's in your studies, your youth ministry, talking with folks, what practices, postures do you see the church needing to take up, if faith is being with and for one another and witnessing to the transcendent God in our cross pressure moments?
Yeah, I mean, this is where your vulnerability thing really comes in the vulnerability to create a space where you invite people to come in to the weekly congregational life from out living their lives, and to be able to narrate uncanny weird things that have happened, or ways that they, I mean, I really think sending people out and seeking for a living God and be able to come back and say, I had this weird experience. How do I make sense of it? And have a community of people that help you discern that story. Because I do think what happens is, as you've kind of pointed to, is that part of what it allows this kind of imminent frame, that this framing that everything is natural material, that there's really no supernatural dynamic to it. Part of the major shift that occurs is when you live in a deeply supernatural or a transcendent era, time itself is different. And there are times where you're in the midst of, and there's often festivals around this and things like that. You're in sacred time, or there's certain people in your society, maybe not everyone, who are only living at sacred time, like monks in monasteries who are always living at sacred time, praying for the whole society. And we don't, when you enter into a modern world, we don't have that sense of time. We don't have the sense of people living at different times, and time being able to be full, and time being able to be sacred. We think of time as a pretty much an empty reality, and it's empty of any real divine consequence. It's empty of any of its sacredness, but that allows for us to do something with it, which is get more out of it, speed it up, get more production, communication, get more travel, be able to get more and more out of it. But what that has the effect of doing is making us have this experiences of time where we can lose, it can become flat, and there's no sacredness to time. So part of, I think, what it is sending people out in the world and then asking them to come back and on a regular basis narrate their experiences of where they felt like time became full. And if they don't have those opportunities to do that, then it's exactly what you're saying. They'll just, something will happen. They'll be like, well, that just happened. And then they just got to speed up and move on and never think about it. And if there isn't a community of people, and social media cannot do this, because social media becomes a whole different language game of you kind of curating yourself and trying to show that you're an interesting self, not someone who can come in vulnerability and humility and be like, so I'm a teacher. I had this weird experience this week where there was a girl in my class and the principal told me that her parents were going through a really ugly divorce. And I was taking my class in from recess and we couldn't find her. And I noticed, I could see her. She was hiding in the slide. I could see her feet from in the tunnel. And I sent my teaching assistant to take the class in. And I went to the bottom of the slide and I sat at the bottom of the slide and I asked her to come down and she came down and I could tell she'd been crying. And I just said to her, honey, if you ever need to talk, I'm here for you. I know this must be a really complicated time. And that's all I said. But we walked in, and as we walked in, she grabbed my hand and she squeezed it. And then we went on with the day. And when I was after school and I was correcting papers, all of a sudden this overwhelming feeling came over me. And I had this sense that God used me, that God had done something in that moment, that in some way, this was one of the most important teaching days of my whole 20-year career, that God had used me. And then to tell that story to a group of people and be like, what do you think? How do I make sense of this? If that teacher doesn't have that community to say, I had this experience this week, and I really felt like the Holy Spirit was saying to me, like, affirming that I was used in the work of God's kingdom this week, then it just goes away. It just, you move on to all these other things. And if you never can we can use the words of proclaim that story. If you never share that, you never get to preach that little sermonette to a small group of people, then those don't become really forming experiences. So I think the first step we do is create these spaces for narrative. And not, again, we're in a time where narrative and storytelling is such a hip thing. And it's not storytelling as an entertainment base, which could get us back to the secular two trap. If we told really good stories with really good musicians around, and then more people would come. But the point of the narrative is the confession and revealing and vulnerability of personhood. And story is so important, narrative is so important because it delivers this other person. And we share in each other's lives in that way. And to me, this is just the heart of Christianity, that the heart of Christianity is that the God of Israel, through the person of Jesus Christ, becomes flesh to share in our personhood. And when the church shares in personhood and shares and when personhood is shared, all that is broken and lost starts to move towards new life, that the Spirit of God starts to bring life out of death when personhood is shared in. And the depth of that transformation wears in every way the marks of the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus. So it's the temperature of our relationships together, as well as our sharing of stories together. And to me, that's all covered with a disposition of being people who pray. And that seems really pietistic. But if we're inside an imminent frame, and really simplistic, but if we're inside an imminent frame, what more powerful way to form faith than to teach people to pray, to be the people who pray, to be the community, to be a community in a larger community who's the praying community, that we pray for the community, that we pray for the world. It's a way of really seeking for a living God inside of an imminent frame.
Well, and as you say that, and I love that you boil it down to prayer. Just go pray. But as you say that, I think about the language that we use in our prayer. Both, again, thinking about internal in the church and external, and thinking about that, expecting an encounter with the presence of God. I've been in churches, I'm sure we've all experienced churches where the prayers themselves don't expect an encounter with the transcendent God. And so what I'm hearing you say is, in some way, our language as pastors, as church leaders in formation, we have to, in some ways, make it normative by the prayers we say, by the questions we ask, by how we send people, that we think we're not going to encounter God, but when you go out there, God is there. You will encounter God, and then come back and tell us about it.
Right.
And we'll be here to experience that with you. It's kind of how I'm hearing you.
Absolutely. And there is a little bit of the dynamic too of that you will encounter God, yes, but you may not for a few months. Or in a small group, a bunch of people may not, but a few people may. And there's a weird kind of individualistic American thing where it's like, well, if I don't experience this, then it must not be true. Like, well, the person next to you is like, I really feel like Jesus spoke to me. And I've heard it. I felt like Jesus spoke to me. And the person next to that person's like, well, I believe that for them, but never happened to me. As if that story doesn't impact you. And so part of the point of the stories is that they reverberate. And because someone in the small group who's told the story has had that experience, it becomes yours in some way now that they share it. And you can believe through those stories. So this is how I see Paul build his churches. Like Paul's kind of like, not all of you have had the kind of experience like I had on the road to Damascus. A couple other people have, but not all of you. But now this is your story too. And now you can believe through this story. Now we can, it shapes us all. It forms us all. So there is this kind of sense of like, God is moving out there. And it may happen that God encounters you, that God speaks to you, that God calls you into ministry, like that teacher, to minister to that little girl by really just communicating that she's not alone. And I think that does happen way more than we think it does, because we don't have these places to share these stories. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is you need a community that can help you make sense of it. Because we are talking about a God who is God. So this God is uncontrollable. And this God is not a mechanism that we can guarantee with anything, that the God of Israel is not a God who is capricious and just or controllable is probably a better way. This God of Israel is kind of capricious. This God shows up when this God shows up. And so sometimes we need to come back to a community and be like, I don't know what happened. Was God at work here? And help us discern that. And then someone say, well, I don't know. You maybe shouldn't have a glass of wine and then take NyQuil. That will make you do weird things. And so there's that dynamic too of how do we discern? How are we discerning? And that all is centered on, I think something that's real central for Taylor, and I think is more and more central for me, is really helping people think about what does it mean to live a good life? What is a good life? And what is that? And what does it mean to live fully and live well? And there is, I think, a deep dynamic of seeking something transcendent, and particularly seeking the movements of God in the world. And it is a seeking. There's no 4 steps and you got it down. There's no do these 6 things with your kids and they'll believe forevermore. There's only the slog of utter beauty of living together in vulnerability, in suffering, in doubt, in hope. And but that's life, and that's utterly beautiful in my book.
I love that, and I love you dropping these nuggets, so that we'll have to have you come back, like asking, "What is the good life?" So,
Right. Yes.
So part 2.
Yes. Right. Exactly.
But bring it, like, as you mentioned Paul, and I thought that was such an interesting naming Paul's singular story that had reverberating consequences for so many others, and you name it well, of our much more individualistic society, thinking like, oh great, Andy, I'm glad you had that experience, but like I never had that experience. So even helping us, that communal nature of stories, of again, not it being a competition of a one-upmanship, but realizing that your story affects me, and is as you proclaim it and as I discern in that with you, it is as much my story now as it was in your story of encountering God. So I wonder, to kind of wrap up, if you'd be willing, if you have a story that you'd be willing to share with us. That if you have a story of encountering the living God, either from people you've encountered or engaged, or from your life itself.
Yeah, I have two of them, and I only gave a little nod because um, I tell the story a lot because it encapsulates things. So if you do have me back now, I've just wasted this bullet and can't use it the next time I talk to you. So, but there's two stories. I mean, one for me is that when I was quite young, I believe I had a real encounter of God's presence, and I had my first friend I ever had died of cancer. He was 4 years old. So one of the first experiences with a friend I had was watching him get cancer and die. And I lived in an upper Midwestern family where you didn't talk a lot about these feelings. I remember being told he died, and then never talking about it again. It's possible we did talk about it, but I don't remember it. And it became a really quite haunting experience. And I had, like, as a 6-year-old, a lot of bad dreams and things like that. And we moved to a new house, and my friend who had died, there was one house in between his house and my house in our old neighborhood, and we moved to a new neighborhood. And now that in the same direction of his house was just a dugout hole for a foundation of a house that they were building in this new neighborhood suburb. And my mom used to tell me never go near it, particularly at dark. Like, don't go by this. I was a kindergartner or something. So I went over there, of course at dark. I went over there, and one day I was in there, and I don't know. I mean, this is me remembering it as older, but it had this like menacing feel to it. Like, it felt like the very abyss that took my friend from the world, that took Benjamin from the world, was somehow represented in that hole. And I used to go, and this is gross, but I used to go and like spit in it, like just go spit in a hole. It was a little Leave It to Beaver, that you find a hole and you spit in it, but it also represented some darkness in the world. And one night I was in there, and I went to really spit into the thing, and I kind of left my feet and slid down into the hole, and I couldn't get out. And so I would run up the wall and slide back down. And I really did feel like I was going to die. The truth of the matter is I was really not in any danger. If I wouldn't have come home in 15 minutes, my parents would have come and found me, but I felt absolutely frightened, like terrified. And the only thing I knew how to do after I couldn't get out after 5 or 6 or 8 tries was remember how all the old ladies at church prayed. And so I prayed and I prayed, and I really had this experience as a 6-year-old of feeling the presence of Jesus come to me and minister to me and then tell me to run. And I ran myself out of that hole. So I think my whole even academic life is trying to make sense of these experiences of, could it have been? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think some people would hear that. The non-believing people of secular theory believe that and be like, ugh, childhood psychosis, or this is the epic of childhood faith. But that was an experience of really feeling encountered, and it making a move in my life. But to tell you a different story that I think is really quite a powerful one, and to try to do this, not have this take too long, but I interviewed a woman for a book that I was writing, and she told me that it was a really hard interview. She was not very into it, and it was about a 40-minute interview, and she seemed like she told me she was busy. She had to get to other things. She had kids and around, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, this isn't working very well. And she was telling me, I'm a single mom. I'm so busy. I'm a single mom. And so every answer was like, yes, no, like very short, thinking this isn't working for me. And I was doing this thing called life history interviewing, where you just write these questions and then you record the conversation and then transcribe it and look for themes. And so you just write 6, 8 questions and then just have a conversation. She wasn't into it. So I had one more question. I decided I would ask it to her. And I was just like a Hail Mary. And I was like, her name was Rachel. And I said, Rachel, have you ever had an experience where you felt really ministered to? Like, you felt like you encountered the presence of the living God, like Jesus Christ was near to you? And she said, yeah, I have. And I never told the story. And she said, I've been telling you that I'm a single mom, but I've never told you why I'm a single mom. She said, I'm a single mom because 4.5 years ago, my husband went on a business trip to Chicago. And this was in Seattle. She said he flew from Seattle to Chicago, and he was gone about 13 and a half hours. And I got a phone call. And it was someone at the hotel he was staying at, and it was incredibly awkward. And the person was saying, ma'am, ma'am, well, ma'am, I've never done anything like this before, but ma'am, 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 our cleaning crew went through your husband's room today, and well, ma'am, there's been an accident, and your husband is dead. And we called an ambulance, and they took him to a hospital morgue, and I need to give you the address of where he is. And so she said she took out a business card, she wrote down the address, and she looked into the room, and she had a toddler and a preschooler, and she thought to herself, my life is over. Like, how do I move on from this? She hung up the phone. She called her mother to stay with her kid. She booked the flight. She knew no one in Chicago. She was going to fly to Chicago. She was going to identify the body, make arrangements, have it flown back to Seattle, and she was going to fly back the same day to Seattle. She knew no one there. So she flew into Chicago. She had the business card with the address on it. She gave it to the cabbie, and he drove. Got into O'Hare, went down to the cab stand, gave the card, he drove. She said, I should have recognized this. I should have recognized that he didn't drop me off up front, that he parked the car. She said, I was drowning in grief. I didn't recognize anything. I didn't know anything. She said, I walked in, and they had the itinerary of when I would be there. So they were expecting me. And as soon as I came in, they took me back. And she said, I stood there, and I had this feeling that as soon as they brought the body before me and they revealed it, my life would be over. She said she stood there, and a gurney was pulled up, and there it was, a body under a sheet. And a young man grabbed it to reveal her husband and started to pull it back. And then she's telling me this, she starts crying, and she says, at that time, I felt a hand on my shoulder and an arm come around the front with a water bottle. And then she really starts sobbing, and she says, it was the cabbie. It was the cabbie. And she said, I got back on that plane, and I knew my life would never be the same, but I knew God wouldn't abandon me. That I've never felt so ministered to in my whole life. Now, there's a beautiful story. The most profound takeaway of that story is I was so blown away by it. I said to her, have you ever told your church this story? And this was somebody who's deeply involved in her church. She said she'd never told anyone at church. She said she never really told that story until she told it to me. She never told her pastor that story. And I have no idea who that cabbie was. Like, there's no, side story. But if you're writing the screenplay, you would write it about her story, and then you'd write about the cabbies. But I can imagine that cabbie needs a community to go to try to make sense of this too. Why did he go in? Did he do the right thing? What led him to it? Did his cousin die and was taken to that morgue? Like, how did he know to join her there? And so I think it's those kind of stories being shared that break open the imminent frame, that they are these experiences like Paul of a death experience, that in vulnerability are shared, and something deeply spiritual, transcendent, dynamic, transformational happens where we're taken up into something really profound. So those are my two stories.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Thanks so much for your time today, for diving us through Taylor and the secular age and faith formation, and just helping us to see and experience what that looks like in our lives and in our church. I truly appreciate this time to have this conversation together.
Yeah, thanks, John, and blessings to your community. And I hope you guys enjoy your next 4 or 5 weeks at Tailgate Church before you have to go inside. And I'm jealous. As a Minnesotan, we're already starting to get cold here, so there's no more outside. So enjoy it while you can, and
Thanks,
blessings to
Andy.
everyone.
Thanks.